Video gaming and language learning. Today we live in a digital world dominated by digital devices and networks, and the use of digital devices has shaped our lives and the way we live and interact with others and our surroundings. Also, digital games have become a big industry with sales of over billions of dollars, and they affect the way people socialize, communicate, play, and learn, which led educators to investigate them as language learning instruments. It's also not surprising to see that most second language teachers today are using digital games as a tool in their classrooms. Accordingly, we would like to discover the experiences of ESL learners who learned English through playing video games and what the implications of these experiences mean to ESL teachers. In order to answer the mentioned questions, I reviewed the literature to discover what researchers said about the effect of learning vocabulary in second language learning and use, the relationship between video gaming and learning, and the connection between gaming and developing interactive skills to promote fluency. All research studies affirm that there is a strong relationship between acquiring vocabulary and language use. Also, researchers describe the relationship between vocabulary knowledge and language use as complementary, which means that knowledge of vocabulary enables language use, and conversely, language use leads to an increase in vocabulary knowledge. Thus, the relationship between vocabulary acquisition and language use could be considered mutual and could allow learners to acquire a second language and communicate successfully in it. Unlike traditional learning, learning through playing video games could add motivation and fun to the learning process. Researchers discovered that students prefer learning that is supported by digital educational games rather than traditional activity-based lessons. They also discovered that the features of video games can support the language acquisition process. However, at a deeper level, challenge and learning are a part of what makes good video games motivating and entertaining. It's also important to select a game in which language plays a role in achieving the ultimate goal of the game, so that the gamers would be involved with language processing while enjoying playing. In order to promote fluency and interactivity in the language, teachers need to use the language in a meaningful, authentic way. Researchers mentioned that audiovisual scenes embedded in the various games that contain animations and videos provide interactivity as they create meaningful simulations that provoke the learners to use the language. Also, video games create new social and cultural environment that facilitates learning by combining thinking, social communication, and technology, which could enable the teacher to find meaningful means to allow the students to communicate in the language. I also looked at findings from other research studies. Dehan investigated teaching and learning English through digital game projects. Two completed projects were described in his paper, Game Design and Game Magazine Creation. The action research projects aim to guide students towards a better understanding of games' formal features and technologies through the reactive creation of games and game-related media, and to improve their spoken and written English language skills. In general, students learned and practiced a variety of language and technology skills with the design projects. The projects motivated the students, challenged them, and provided many opportunities for authentic discussions in the foreign language. Wang has studied the effect of using communicative language games in teaching and learning English in Taiwanese primary schools. The aim of this study was to examine the use of communicative language games for teaching and learning English in Taiwanese elementary schools. The participants were 150 teachers teaching in Taiwanese primary schools. The instrument used was a variety questionnaire about participants' perspectives on the use of communicative language games in English lessons. The results of the study provided encouraging evidence to indicate that Taiwanese elementary school teachers generally appreciated the benefits and value of communicative game activities in the teaching of English language. Chen and Yang examined the effects of a commercial adventure video game on foreign language learning and the learner's perceptions toward this game. 21 college students in Taiwan were asked to play an English adventure game called Bone. One group was allowed to take notes while playing and the other group was not. After playing, both groups were asked to take a vocabulary post-test. The results indicated that both groups picked up some new words after playing the adventure game, but there was no significant difference between the two groups' post-gaming performances. To better understand the strengths and weaknesses of using adventure games for foreign language learning, another study was conducted to explore 35 college students' perceptions toward this adventure game. The results showed that students considered the game helpful in improving their language skills and motivation. Students also reported they enjoyed playing the game because of the intriguing game design. Klimova and Cassett have studied the efficiency of computer games on language learning and listed its benefits and limitations for foreign language learning. This was done by conducting a literature search in the databases, like Web of Science, ScienceDirect, and Springer, and consequently by evaluating the findings of the relevant studies. The findings indicated that computer games, especially the educational ones, are effective in the vocabulary acquisition and foreign language learning. In addition, there are other benefits of using computer games in classrooms, such as exposure to the target language, increased engagement, or enhancement of learners' involvement in communication. Finally, I conducted a little case study on a Quebecer who has had the experience of learning English through playing video games. I conducted the case study on one participant who learned English through playing video games. He lives in the province of Quebec and his mother tongue is French, but his English is quite fluent and he can communicate so well in the language. He started learning English when he was 10 years old through playing games. I decided to interview him because he was a good example of a successful second language learner. In order to check the learner's experience, I interviewed him and I created a short recording. I interviewed the participants using an open-ended questionnaire. The participant mentioned that he didn't learn how to speak English at school because he only had 2 hours of ESL per week as of 4th grade in elementary school, and it didn't enable him to speak the language. Also, there was no one to speak English with in the place where he grew up. On the other hand, he managed to learn to speak the language and communicate in it through playing story-like and role-playing games, which allowed him to learn a lot of vocabulary words and motivated him to speak. He played games daily till he was able to build a good vocabulary repertoire, and that allowed him to speak the language and understand thoroughly his missions and proceed to the next level while playing. It also took him around 4 or 5 years before he became confident in speaking the language. Finally, the participant ended the interview by saying, "I was learning while having fun, so it was the best of 2 worlds." In the recording, the participant stated the following.
Video gaming helped me a lot learn my English because when I was young, I was living in Rimouski, which is not a big English town to say the least. So I learned my English by playing video games, but role playing games, not button mashing games or sports games, because these aren't really used for as far as language goes. So what I was doing is I had to read what the characters were saying on screen, and I had to understand what they were saying and where I needed to go. So for me to progress in my game, I had to understand the language. So I had the dictionary next to me, reading, translating what was on screen, and that's how I learned my English. And with me growing up, the games also changed, and instead of just reading, they became speaking characters. So it helped a lot further my progress with the development of video gaming at the same time. So my bases were made with the old games, the 2D, the old 2D games where you had to read, but it got to another level as soon as the video games had characters talking in role-playing games. That's how I learned my English.
I was able to conclude that the participant learned the language mainly through playing video games. He decided to learn the language in order to be able to play video games that were only available in English, so he learned the language to play games and not the other way around. However, through playing games, he managed to build a good vocabulary repertoire that allowed him to use the language and to communicate in it fluently later. The results from my case study confirmed with what I found in the literature and most of the findings of the studies that I also reviewed. So I was able to find that playing interactive video games could strongly affect the language learning process through allowing gamers to build a vocabulary repertoire and use the language in a meaningful way. Also, well-designed digital games could have positive effects on the learning process. Moreover, it was also evident that video games accompanied with a reward system provide better motivation and facilitate the learning process of children and their cognitive achievement. The learning process becomes much more enjoyable by engaging the learners in such games, and the stresses involved in the learning process are drastically reduced. There is also a relationship between language learning in early ages and digital games because children understand language with digital games easily. However, the lack of knowledge about computer games among language teachers and institutions might hinder their proper use. Accordingly, certain implications should be considered that include the following. If we as educators want to connect to learners and make the lessons interesting for them, then we need to acknowledge the word of the learners, and digital games are a big part of today's learners' world. The issue of employing games in education with students experiencing medical conditions such as ADHD and dyslexia could also be explored. Thirdly, incorporating a reward system while deploying games could enhance children's performance and motivate them to learn faster. There is also now an increasing interest in investigating whether video games might be offering a powerful new resource to support learning in the information age. There is a positive relationship between language learning in early ages and digital games. Moreover, digital games capture the attention of young learners, therefore it's advisable to use games in early elementary levels to facilitate learning. Also, instead of making students do a lot of homework in a threatening environment after class and repeating after the teacher all the time aimlessly, a good and energetic teacher can encourage the creativity and imagination of the learners by using digital games because they are fun and children like to play them. Finally, some recent research studies mention that gaming might have an effect on the learner's attention span. Therefore, further studies are needed to deliberately investigate those effects. Finally, the benefits could be attained through gaming, but the contexts within which these games are used need to be monitored and supervised by individuals who have received adequate training or parents who are well informed in the use of games in order to promote language learning. Thus, it's not recommended for parents and teachers to allow minors to spend an unrealistic amount of time playing interactive games, as there might be some obvious risks involved in condoning such behavior. Thanks for listening.